Welcome to Cannabis History. This channel explores the forgotten stories, hidden figures, ancient uses, political battles, and cultural moments that shaped the world's relationship with cannabis. Today we are looking at one of the most misunderstood chapters in history, hemp in colonial America. This episode is about how the 13 colonies became the United States, and how hemp was woven into the material world that helped this new country survive, trade, rebel, and become an empire on the rise. Chapter 1. The Rise of the British Empire. Before there were motorized trains, cars, airplanes, or steamships, there was the Age of Sail, and in that world, empire moved by sea. Beginning in the late 1400s, European powers began racing across the Atlantic and around the globe. Portugal and Spain were among the first to build overseas empires, using ocean routes to reach Africa, Asia, and the Americas. England entered that competition more slowly, but by the late 1500s and early 1600s, it was trying to turn exploration into permanent colonies, trade routes, and naval power. In 1497, John Cabot sailed under the authority of England's King Henry VII and reached the coast of North America. A century later, England was still trying to establish a permanent foothold across the Atlantic. In 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh was granted a charter by Queen Elizabeth I, authorizing him to explore, colonize, and rule remote heathen and barbarous lands not possessed by any Christian monarch. Once again, this colony failed to take off, but in 1606, King James I officially granted a new royal charter to the investors of the Virginia Company of London. This first charter of Virginia permitted them to establish a settlement on the North American coast, leading to England's first permanent colony, known as Jamestown, a year later. Finally having their foot in the door to the New World, England's overseas ambitions expanded. Colonies developed in North America and the Caribbean, leading English merchants and settlers to cross the Atlantic and joint stock companies to organize trade and settlement. And by the mid-1600s, England was using laws like the Navigation Acts to keep colonial trade inside the English imperial system. Colonies were expected to provide raw materials. English ships were expected to carry the trade, and wealth was supposed to flow back toward the mother country. By 1707, after the Union of England and Scotland created Great Britain, this imperial system grew even larger. During the 1700s, Britain competed with France, Spain, and other European powers across North America, and by 1763, Britain emerged as the dominant power in the region. But all of this depended on ships. Chapter 2. Why ships made hemp a strategic resource. During Britain's rise to becoming an empire, ships were the safest and fastest means of travel and transporting goods. Ships carried soldiers, settlers, tobacco, sugar, textiles, weapons, paper, laws, letters, enslaved people, and profits. They connected Britain to North America, the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and the wider world. But in order to preserve that system, those ships depended on routine maintenance and materials like rope, sails, rigging, cordage, and canvas to keep them moving. And that is where hemp comes in. Hemp was prized for its combination of strength, durability, flexibility, and availability, which made it especially useful in colonial society. A ship built between the 1400s and the mid-1800s was basically a floating machine made from wood, iron, cloth, and miles of rope. Those materials had to survive saltwater, heavy winds, constant strain, and brutal weather. That is why hemp was a strategic crop. It was not just another plant sitting in a field. It was tied to naval power, merchant shipping, and imperial supply chains. As an island nation, Britain understood that if ships were the backbone of national defense and economic power, then hemp was one of the materials helping hold that backbone together. But hemp was also part of a larger category of materials known as naval stores. Naval stores were the supplies needed to build, maintain, and repair wooden ships, including things like timber, masts, tar, pitch, turpentine, resin, hemp, flax, sailcloth, and cordage. By the 17th century, Britain was heavily dependent on the Baltic region for many of these materials. Countries and regions around the Baltic, including Sweden, Russia, Latvia, and other northern European suppliers, played a major role in providing the hemp, timber, tar, and pitch that maritime powers needed. That dependence created a problem. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, Sweden's control over parts of the naval stores trade, including the export of high-quality tar, became a serious concern for England. Swedish tar was so important that it became known as Stockholm tar. And for years, its export was controlled through a royal monopoly. When prices rose or war disrupted trade, access to materials could become uncertain. So Parliament began looking to the American colonies as an alternative source. In the early 1700s, England passed laws to encourage the importation of naval stores from the colonies. One important policy, passed in 1705, offered financial encouragement for colonial naval stores, so Britain would not have to rely so heavily on Baltic suppliers. The goal was simple. If the colonies could produce tar, pitch, masts, hemp, and other shipbuilding materials, Britain could strengthen its navy while reducing dependence on foreign markets. That tells us how strategic these materials were. A shortage of hemp, tar, pitch, or masts was not just an agricultural inconvenience. It could threaten a nation's ability to defend itself, protect trade, and supply its ships. So when the English looked to North America, they were not only searching for gold and natural resources, they were also looking for land they could settle, crops they could grow, and raw materials that could make the colonies useful to the empire. Hemp fit directly into that vision. Chapter 3. The Atlantic Trade System. When English colonists arrived in North America in the early 1600s, they were not simply trying to survive. Their goal was to develop settlements that could produce crops, raw materials, and goods that would benefit England and support its growing imperial ambitions. This is what made the Atlantic trade system so important. It was an interconnected web of commerce that moved goods, labor, money, and power between Britain, the American colonies, the Caribbean, Africa, and the rest of its empire. It created enormous wealth and helped fund Britain's expansion, but it was not a simple or equal relationship. The system was built around imperial control. In theory, the colonies existed to support the needs of the mother country. In practice, colonial merchants, planters, and workers also developed their own local economies inside that larger imperial system. Because of that, colonists and colonial officials wanted crops that could reduce dependence on imports and strengthen Atlantic trade. Hemp fit that need perfectly. It was practical, adaptable, and already familiar to Europeans as a source of rope, canvas, cordage, and cloth. This is why hemp appears so early in colonial law. In August 1633, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed an act requiring planters to provide seed for flax and hemp and to sow it. The wording stated that every planter, as soon as he may, provide seed of flax and hempe and sow the same. The point was clear. Colonial leaders wanted fiber crops grown because they served practical and imperial needs. By the 1700s, Parliament was using importation policies and incentives to encourage the colonies to produce the raw materials Britain needed. If the colonies could produce strong fiber crops, Britain could reduce its dependence on foreign supply chains while strengthening the Atlantic trade system that tied the empire together. In the early 1720s, colonial lawmakers offered a bounty of 4 shillings for every gross hundred of water-retted, bright, and clean hemp. This was not just casual encouragement. It was a payment system designed to reward production and improve quality. Plantation owners like Colonel William Byrd, the second of Westover, took notice and began experimenting with hemp on a serious scale. Byrd was a wealthy planter, writer, surveyor, and member of the Virginia Governor's Council. His estate at Westover sat inside the same tidewater plantation world where tobacco dominated the economy. In the spring of 1729, Byrd reportedly sowed 90 bushels of hemp seed, which was enough for roughly 36 acres or more. That was not a small garden experiment at the time. Most tidewater planters grew only a fraction of that amount, keeping most of their acreage in tobacco and other cash crops. Byrd's hemp planting shows that some colonists were willing to test hemp seriously as a plantation crop. Then, in 1764, Parliament passed an act for granting a bounty upon the importation of hemp and rough and undressed flax from His Majesty's colonies in America. This law showed that hemp and flax were still important enough for Britain to encourage through direct financial incentives. The bounties also caught the attention of George Washington. In September 1765, Washington wrote to his London sales agent, Robert Carey and Company, asking what price he might expect for good hemp in London if it was watered and prepared according to the Act of Parliament. He wanted to know the freight costs, charges, and possible profits from growing it. His letters show hemp was not just an abstract imperial crop. Planters were watching the market, asking about prices and calculating profit. But hemp's value came with a serious problem. And that is where the story of hemp moves from markets and bounties into the fields. Chapter 4. The hard labor behind hemp. One of the most important things to understand about hemp cultivation is that it was hard, labor-intensive work. Before hemp could become a usable fiber, it had to be planted, harvested, and processed. And in the colonial period, this was not a quick or easy ordeal. Hemp stalks first had to be harvested and dried. Then they had to be retted, which meant exposing the stalks to moisture so bacteria and fungi could loosen the fibers from the woody core of the plant. This could be done by soaking the stalks in water or leaving them spread out in the field for dew retting. Water retting could take only several days under the right conditions, while dew retting could take weeks. If hemp was under-retted, the fiber was hard to separate. If it was over-retted, the fiber could rot and weaken. After retting, the stalks had to be dried again and then broken. To do this, workers used hand tools such as a wooden hemp brake to crush the woody stalks and separate the outer fibers from the inner core. Then came scutching, where the broken stalk material was beaten or scraped away from the fiber. After that, the fiber could be hackled or combed through metal teeth to clean and align it before it was spun or twisted into usable material. Before modern decortication machinery, people had to do much of this work by hand. Every step required time, strength, and experience. Hemp was valuable because it produced strong fiber, but getting that fiber out of the stalk was difficult work. And in plantation regions like Virginia, that work was often done by indentured servants and enslaved laborers. That means the history of hemp is not just a story about rope, canvas, ships, and trade. It is also a story about labor, coercion, and force. Chapter 5. From indentured servants to enslaved labor. Before the widespread use of agricultural machinery, landowners relied heavily on human and animal labor to cultivate and process their crops. In the early colonial period, much of this work was performed by indentured servants. These were people who could not afford the cost of passage across the Atlantic. In exchange for transportation to the colonies, along with food, shelter, and basic support, they agreed to work for a set number of years. After their term ended, the indentured servant was supposed to become free, and in some cases they received additional compensation such as money and land. It is important to understand that indentured servitude was not the same as slavery. Indentured servants were hired by the landowner by a contract that provided the individual with terms and conditions for their work, as well as an end date for their service. They also had certain protections under English common law, but that did not mean their lives were easy. Many endured exhausting and sometimes brutal physical labor in fields, on plantations, in workshops, and inside colonial households. Many faced harsh treatment, disease, punishment, and difficult living conditions. And in plantation colonies like Virginia, their labor helped build the agricultural economy that crops like tobacco, flax, and hemp depended on. This system brought huge numbers of workers into colonial America. For example, historian Abbott Emerson Smith, in his book Colonists in Bondage, estimated that between 1/2 and 2/3 of all migrants to the British colonies between the 1630s and the American Revolution came as indentured servants. Similarly, legal historian Christopher Tomlins, in his work on indentured servitude in British America, estimated that of roughly the 450,000 voluntary European arrivals to the 13 colonies before 1775, about 48% came as indentured servants. To put this number into perspective, the total number of European immigrants before 1775 was about 500 to 550,000 people total. But over time, especially as plantation agriculture expanded and the demand for permanent labor grew, the system began to shift. From the perspective of plantation owners, indentured servitude came with too many limitations. Indentured servants had legal rights, their contracts came with a cost, and the labor was temporary. As a result, plantation owners increasingly turned toward the forced labor of enslaved people from Africa. This shift was not accidental. It was built through law, violence, racial control, and economic interest. By the early 1700s, slavery was expanding across British North America, especially in plantation regions like the Chesapeake and the Lower South. In the article Economy of Colonial British America, historian Aaron Slater describes an almost constant demand for land and labor. And while New England and the middle colonies continued to rely more on family labor and European indentured servants, the Chesapeake, Carolina, and West Indian colonies developed into slave societies, where captive Africans were imported in large numbers and forced to work on colonial plantations. The numbers show how large this system had become. Around 1750, the British mainland colonies had a population of roughly 1.5 million people, and nearly 1 in 5 people, about 300,000, were enslaved. In Virginia and Maryland alone, nearly 145,000 enslaved people lived and worked, many of them in tobacco fields. So by the 1700s, slavery was no longer on the margins of colonial life. It had become deeply connected to plantation agriculture, export crops, land expansion, and the growing wealth of the British Atlantic world. So when we talk about hemp in colonial America, we are not just talking about rope, canvas, ships, and trade. We are also talking about the labor systems that made those materials possible. Chapter 6. Hemp and the American Revolution. The American Revolution is often remembered through speeches, battles, declarations, and famous names. But revolutions also depend on supply chains. For example, armies need clothing, navies need sails, rigging, and cordage, and political movements need newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, and letters. Independence was not just a political idea. It was a logistical problem. This was one of the key points in Thomas Paine's 47-page pamphlet, Common Sense. In 1776, Paine was trying to convince Americans that independence was possible. He argued that the colonies had the raw materials needed for their defense, and when he listed those resources, he included hemp. That one line tells us a lot about hemp in the American Revolution. For Paine, hemp was evidence that America had what it needed to break away from Britain. And he was not the only one to think so. John Adams also recognized that independence required more than speeches and resolutions. In a 1776 memorandum of measures to be pursued by the Second Continental Congress, Adams included hemp among the materials that needed to be grown. That shows that hemp was not only part of agricultural life, it was part of how revolutionary leaders thought about preparation, supply, and self-sufficiency. In other words, hemp was part of the practical side of independence. Once fighting began in 1775, the need for hemp became even more urgent. For ground troops, hemp products could be used in clothing, tents, sacks, and other supplies. But for naval forces, hemp was even more important. As a navy could not function without rope, sails, and rigging. During the American Revolution, there were state-sponsored fleets as well as the Continental Navy, and every ship needed cordage. To provide a sense of scale, one vessel in the Virginia Navy, the Brigantine Liberty, reportedly required more than 2 miles of cordage. As wartime demand increased, hemp prices rose dramatically, and states like Virginia became vital to the supply chain. During the Revolution, Virginia had at least 18 rope walks, which were industrial operations devoted to making cordage. But finding hemp during wartime was not always easy. In 1779, Alexander Sinclair wrote from Staunton, Virginia, to officials connected with the public rope walk at Warwick. He explained that he had struggled to purchase hemp because local sellers were demanding extremely high prices. His letter reveals an important wartime problem. Virginia possessed the facilities to manufacture rope, but still required a steady supply of processed fiber. That supply chain began in the countryside, where hemp had to be harvested, retted, broken, and cleaned before it could be delivered to a rope walk. Virginia therefore also relied on hemp mills and on local processing operations that prepared the crop for sale. One surviving sale record lists a substantial amount of finished hemp fiber. The quantity involved suggests two important things. First, a meaningful quantity of hemp was being processed close to where it was grown. Second, this processed fiber was entering a larger wartime network that connected farms, mills, merchants, rope walks, and military supply operations. During the Revolution, hemp helped answer one urgent question. Could the colonies supply themselves well enough to survive a war for independence? But after independence, that question became even bigger. Could the new United States build the materials, industries, and supply chains it needed to become a power of its own? Chapter 7. Hemp after Independence. After the Revolution, hemp did not disappear from American life. It became part of a new question. Could the United States build the materials, industries, and supply chains it needed to become a power of its own? The new nation had broken away from the British Empire, but it still lived in a world of ships, ports, farms, armies, trade, and manufacturing. Political independence was not enough. The United States needed to be economically free as well. The new nation had won the war, but it was not financially secure. The Revolution left Congress and the states buried in debt, and American credit was fragile. Political leaders at the time understood that the country still depended on Europe for the materials, manufacturing, and supplies it needed to survive. The country had to supply its own ships, encourage manufacturing, and reduce dependence on foreign materials. But perhaps most importantly, it needed to create one national economy. And once again, hemp fit neatly into that vision. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton submitted his report on manufactures to Congress. Hamilton was not writing about hemp as a curiosity. He was thinking about how the United States could build national strength through manufacturing, industry, and economic self-sufficiency. In that report, Hamilton specifically discussed flax and hemp. He listed their manufactures as cables, sailcloth, cordage, twine, and packthread. He also connected sailcloth to navigation and defense, and suggested government encouragement for materials grown in the United States. Hamilton's report to Congress shows us that hemp was not just another agricultural crop. It was part of how the early United States thought about manufacturing, national strength, and economic independence. George Washington also saw hemp as part of the early American economy. Documents from his plantation at Mount Vernon state that Washington grew hemp at all 5 farms that made up the estate. Hemp was grown and processed for rope, sail canvas, clothing, sewing thread for sacks, and repairing the large seine nets Washington relied on in his fishing operation along the Potomac River. Washington had considered whether hemp might become a more profitable alternative to tobacco, but ultimately shifted Mount Vernon more heavily toward wheat and other crops. Still, hemp remained part of his agricultural world. In 1794, Washington was still discussing hemp seed in his correspondences about his estate. Writing to his farm manager, William Pierce, Washington said he was glad the gardener had saved seed of India hemp and instructed that the hemp could be sown again. Thomas Jefferson also fits into this larger story. Jefferson grew hemp at his estate's Monticello and Poplar Forest, where enslaved laborers cultivated hemp, flax, and cotton. Records show that Jefferson paid close attention to hemp cultivation, seed, spinning, breaking, and processing. He wrote about how much hemp a worker could tend, how much fiber an acre could yield, and how much could be broken in a day. By 1811, Jefferson was still giving instructions for hemp at his Poplar Forest estate. He directed that an acre of good ground be selected for a permanent hemp patch and that hemp be prepared so spinners could continue working. In 1815, Jefferson's farm records show 3 hemp spinners in the Monticello textile shop. Their names were Aggie, Nanny, and Isabel. The annual hemp requirement was 400 pounds to be spun over 26 weeks. Jefferson also understood one of hemp's biggest problems. Processing it was difficult. In 1815, he wrote that hemp was productive, but that breaking and beating it by hand was slow, laborious, and heavily complained of by the laborers. Because of that, Jefferson experimented with adapting mechanical power to a hemp brake. He connected hemp processing to a sawmill and later to a threshing machine, trying to reduce the labor required to break and beat the stalks. James Madison also recognized the importance of hemp in the early American economy. Madison came out of the same Virginia plantation world as Washington and Jefferson. His family estate, Montpelier, was part of a plantation economy built around land, agriculture, and enslaved labor. In 1784, Madison wrote to Jefferson that the price of hemp had fallen after peace, while the price of tobacco had risen. That detail may seem small, but it shows that hemp was part of the economic conversation among Virginia elites after the Revolution. These men were not simply talking about ideals. They were tracking crops, prices, labor, markets, and supply chains. And that is why hemp belongs in the American story, because before the United States could become a modern nation, it had to build the farms, fibers, workshops, ships, policies, and supply chains that made national power possible. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of today's episode. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you're notified when we release more content like this. Also be sure to check out our YouTube channel, Cannabis History, where we explore the ancient roots and modern impact of one of the world's most misunderstood plants. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, keep being awesome, my friends.